The Second World War, a global cataclysm often painted in stark monochrome, a definitive struggle of good versus evil, populated by familiar heroes and undisputed villains. We recall the iconic battles, the grand speeches, the pivotal moments that shaped a new world order. But what if the canvas we've been shown is incomplete? What if beneath the surface of this epic narrative lies a complex tapestry woven with threads of untold stories, overlooked perspectives, and hidden agendas? This documentary, World War II Unveiled, The Secrets, Sacrifices, and Silences History Forgot, embarks on an unprecedented journey beyond the conventional retelling. We will challenge the comfortable narratives, venturing into the economic roots that fueled the conflict, exploring the forgotten struggles of nations and peoples whose voices were silenced by the march of empires. We will confront the moral ambiguities that permeated every decision, examining the uncomfortable truths about alliances, betrayals, and the compromises made in the crucible of total war. From the quiet desperation of occupied territories to the profound, long-lasting consequences etched into the geopolitical landscape and the human psyche, we will explore the intricate layers history books often omit. Across 48 comprehensive sections, we invite you to peel back the layers of propaganda and selective memory, to witness the profound sacrifices that went unacknowledged, and to understand the silences that still resonate today. Prepare to see World War II not as a settled past, but as a living legacy, profoundly shaping our present in ways we rarely discuss until now. The popular narrative of World War II often begins and ends with the Treaty of Versailles, portraying it as the singular seed of German resentment. But to truly understand the fertile ground upon which conflict grew, we must look deeper beyond punitive reparations into the churning currents of global finance and an economic cataclysm that spared no nation. By the mid-1920s, a fragile illusion of stability was propped up by American loans to Germany, notably the Dawes and Young plans. This house of cards collapsed spectacularly with the Black Tuesday crash of 1929, plunging the world into the Great Depression. The reverberations were immediate and devastating. In Germany, unemployment soared from 2 million to an agonizing 6 million by 1932. Factories lay silent, banks failed, and the specter of hyperinflation, a recent and terrifying memory, haunted the collective consciousness. The middle class, once the bedrock of stability, was decimated, leaving a chasm of despair that extremist ideologies rushed to fill. Across the globe, nations desperate to protect their own collapsing industries erected towering tariff barriers, sparking vicious trade wars. International trade plummeted by an astonishing 66% between 1929 and 1934. This economic isolationism strangled global cooperation and fueled a dangerous beggar-thy-neighbor policy, where national survival seemed to depend on the economic demise of others. Japan, dependent on exports, saw its economy crippled, hardening its resolve to seize resource-rich territories in Asia. Italy, under Mussolini, doubled down on autarky and imperial expansion to secure vital resources. It was this crucible of economic desperation, widespread poverty, a shattered global financial system, and the aggressive pursuit of national economic self-interest that provided fertile ground for the rise of authoritarian regimes. These leaders, from Hitler to Mussolini to Japan's militarists, promised order amidst chaos, national pride amidst humiliation, and economic revival through expansion and conquest. The Treaty of Versailles may have scarred, but it was the Great Depression that infected the wound, metastasizing into a global pathology that made war not just possible, but tragically inevitable. The world was not merely recovering from one war. It was unwittingly constructing the economic scaffolding for the next. As the storm clouds gathered over Europe, Britain, the world's preeminent imperial power, found itself in a precarious position. Its vast empire, stretching across every continent, was both its greatest strength and its most significant vulnerability. From the jungles of Malaya to the deserts of North Africa. From the bustling ports of India to the strategic choke points of the Suez Canal, Britain's commitments were boundless. But with war looming, how could a nation stretched so thin defend its distant possessions while simultaneously preparing for an existential fight on its doorstep? The illusion of imperial invincibility was already fraying. Maintaining control over a quarter of the world's population was an immense drain on resources, even in peacetime. The 1930s saw increasing nationalist movements challenging British rule, particularly in India. When war broke out in September 1939, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain declared war on Germany on behalf of the entire empire, often without consulting the colonies themselves. This unilateral declaration immediately highlighted the complex and often conflicted loyalties of colonial subjects. Millions across the empire answered the call to arms, driven by a myriad of motivations: loyalty to the crown, economic necessity, a desire for adventure, or, crucially, the hope that their service might pave the way for greater autonomy, perhaps even independence, after the conflict. The Indian Army alone swelled to over 2.5 million men, becoming the largest volunteer army in history, fighting with distinction in North Africa, Italy, and Southeast Asia. Yet, this incredible contribution came at a cost. Resources and manpower desperately needed for imperial defense had to be diverted to the European front. Strategic strongholds like Singapore, once considered impregnable, were dangerously under-resourced, their garrisons stripped to reinforce the home front, ultimately contributing to their catastrophic fall to the Japanese in 1942. Britain's imperial dilemma was a constant, agonizing strategic calculation: protect the heart or defend the extremities. Every ship, every plane, every soldier deployed overseas meant fewer at home. This tension between the demands of empire and the survival of the nation itself would fundamentally reshape Britain's war effort and, ultimately, accelerate the slow, inevitable twilight of its global dominion. The economic instability gripping the world, discussed earlier, only intensified this imperial strain, forcing Britain to make increasingly difficult choices that would echo for decades. While Britain grappled with the strains of empire, its closest ally, France, was facing a crisis of its own, not on distant shores, but deep within its very soul. The years leading up to 1939 were a period of profound political instability, economic stagnation, and bitter social unrest that left the nation profoundly fractured and ill-prepared for the storm to come. This went far beyond mere military unpreparedness. It was a societal malaise. The Third Republic, France's parliamentary democracy, was a revolving door of governments, with coalitions forming and collapsing with dizzying regularity. Between 1932 and 1940, France sought 10 different governments, each too short-lived to implement coherent, long-term policies. This chronic instability bred cynicism and mistrust among the populace, rendering effective national leadership almost impossible. Economically, France stagnated, battered by the Great Depression's ripple effects, even if not to the same degree as Germany. High unemployment persisted, industrial production lagged, and a deep-seated fear of renewed German aggression led to a cautious, defensive mindset that permeated both military and political strategy. Socially, France was a nation at war with itself. The rise of the left-wing Popular Front government in 1936, led by Léon Blum, brought significant social reforms, but also intensified class divisions and anti-capitalist sentiments. Mass strikes paralyzed industries vital for rearmament, and conservative elements viewed the government with suspicion, even hostility. On the right, powerful nationalist and anti-democratic movements gained traction, openly admiring fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. This internal strife, a constant tug-of-war between competing ideologies, sapped national unity and created a climate of suspicion, making a unified response to external threats incredibly difficult. While France poured vast resources into the construction of the Maginot Line, a colossal network of fortifications along its eastern border, This defensive posture became a symbol of its deeper paralysis. It offered a false sense of security, fostering a belief that France could simply wait out any aggression. But beneath the concrete and steel, the nation's internal fractures widened, leaving it weak, demoralized, and psychologically unprepared for the blitzkrieg that would tear through its defenses in mere weeks in May 1940. France's swift collapse wasn't just a military failure. It was the tragic culmination of years of a nation divided against itself, a crucial, often overlooked prelude to the unfolding global conflict. Even as France grappled with internal divisions and Britain with imperial strain, an often overlooked conflict ignited on the frigid plains of northern Europe, revealing profound lessons about national will and military might. The Winter War, from November 1939 to March 1940, pitted tiny Finland against the massive Soviet Union, a David and Goliath struggle that defied all expectations. Stalin, eager to secure Leningrad and bolster Soviet defenses, demanded territorial concessions from Finland. When the Finns refused, the Red Army, boasting millions of men and thousands of tanks and aircraft, launched a full-scale invasion. The world braced for a swift conquest. Yet, what unfolded was a testament to the indomitable spirit of a small nation defending its sovereignty. The Finnish forces, numbering a mere 250,000 men and woefully under-equipped, turned their harsh, snow-laden terrain into their greatest ally. Dressed in white camouflage, equipped with skis and masters of their environment, they employed ingenious Mahdi tactics, encircling and chopping Soviet formations into isolated pockets, then systematically destroying them. Legendary figures like Simo Häyhä, the White Death, a Finnish sniper credited with over 500 confirmed kills, became symbols of their fierce resistance. The fortified Mannerheim Line, a series of defensive positions across the Karelian Isthmus, absorbed immense Soviet pressure, inflicting horrific casualties. The Winter War exposed the shocking weaknesses within the Red Army, severely depleted by Stalin's purges of its officer corps in the late 1930s. Poor leadership, inadequate training for winter warfare, and outdated tactics led to catastrophic losses. Yet, despite their astonishing bravery and initial successes, the imbalance of power was simply too great. Finland received only limited international aid, as the world watched, largely unable or unwilling to intervene directly against the Soviet Union. After 105 brutal days, with Soviet forces eventually breaking through the Mannerheim Line by sheer weight of numbers and a desperate tactical overhaul, Finland was forced to sign the Moscow Peace Treaty, ceding significant territory. But their desperate stand resonated globally. It was a stark demonstration that even against overwhelming odds, national will and strategic ingenuity could exact a terrible price from an aggressor. And crucially, it offered Hitler a dangerous, misleading insight into the perceived weakness of the Soviet military, contributing to his fateful decision to launch Operation Barbarossa just over a year later. The Winter War had inadvertently offered a dangerous miscalculation to Hitler. Convinced of the Soviet Union's military ineptitude, he unleashed Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, the largest land invasion in human history. Yet, beyond the staggering scale of tank battles and frontline clashes, lay a hidden, genocidal war, a scorched earth nightmare that devastated civilian populations and left an indelible scar on the land itself. This was not merely a military campaign. It was an ideological war of annihilation. From the outset, Barbarossa was framed by Nazi ideology as a war for Lebensraum, living space, and the destruction of Judeo-Bolshevism. This meant the deliberate targeting of not just soldiers, but entire civilian populations. The infamous General Plan Ost outlined plans for the extermination, enslavement, and forced displacement of millions of Slavs, Jews, and other undesirables to create agrarian colonies for Germans. The Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads, followed closely behind the Wehrmacht, systematically murdering over 1 million Jews and countless others in mass shootings across Eastern Europe. Cities like Leningrad endured a horrific 872-day siege, where over 1 million citizens perished, not primarily from German shells, but from systematic starvation, a deliberate policy to depopulate the city. As the German advance faltered and then reversed, the Red Army enacted its own scorched earth policy, denying resources to the invaders. Subsequently, the retreating Wehrmacht unleashed unprecedented environmental devastation, destroying infrastructure, mines and factories, poisoning wells, and leveling entire towns and villages. Forests, once ancient, were annihilated, leaving vast swaths of Eastern Europe as barren wastelands. The scale of destruction, both human and environmental, was mind-boggling. 27 million Soviet citizens died in the war, the vast majority of them civilians. This unparalleled human cost, often overshadowed by the epic military engagements, represents a deliberate policy of extermination and systematic destruction. Barbarossa was not just a clash of armies. It was a brutal assault on humanity and the very fabric of the land, leaving wounds that festered for generations and permanently altered the demographic and ecological landscape of Eastern Europe. It remains the deadliest testament to the total war ideology. As Operation Barbarossa consumed the Eastern Front, a lifeline was extended from across the Atlantic, a lifeline that would ultimately prove decisive: the Lend-Lease Act. Often presented as a benevolent act of generosity from the arsenal of democracy, its true nature was far more complex, a strategic masterstroke that cemented American influence, shaped post-war global order, and came with a significant, often overlooked price. Enacted in March 1941, months before America's entry into the war, Lend-Lease allowed the U.S. to lend, lease, or otherwise dispose of military equipment, food, and other vital supplies to nations deemed essential to American security. Churchill famously called it the most unsorted act, but it was anything but charity. It was a pragmatic, albeit brilliant, move by President Franklin D. Roosevelt to support the Allies against the Axis powers without immediate direct military involvement, thereby avoiding a repeat of the diplomatic and economic headaches of World War I war debts. Between 1941 and 1945, the U.S. supplied over $50 billion worth of aid, equivalent to over $700 billion today, to 40 nations. The United Kingdom was the primary recipient, receiving some $31.4 billion, including everything from tanks and aircraft to foodstuffs and industrial materials. The Soviet Union received over $11 billion in critical supplies, including Studebaker trucks and locomotives, which were vital for maintaining the Red Army's logistical arteries after the devastation of Barbarossa. China, France, and other allied nations also benefited significantly. However, Lend-Lease was not free. While payment for items consumed in the war was deferred or negotiated, recipients were required to provide reverse Lend-Lease, supplying goods, services, and military bases to U.S. forces. More significantly, the act bound recipient nations to American economic and political terms. Britain, for instance, had to dismantle its imperial trade preferences, opening up its markets to American goods post-war, effectively liquidating its gold reserves and further depleting its already strained economy. This economic leverage ensured American industrial might translated directly into global diplomatic power, laying the groundwork for the post-war Pax Americana. Lend-Lease didn't just win battles. It redrew the economic and geopolitical map, creating debts and dependencies that would profoundly shape the Cold War and the decolonization era. While the world attention was fixed on the battlefields of Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific, a brutal, often forgotten struggle raged in one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth, the Arctic. This was a secret war of attrition, fought not just against the enemy, but against the unforgiving elements for control of vital strategic resources and indispensable sea lanes. The Arctic convoys, codenamed PQ and JW, were a lifeline to the Soviet Union after Operation Barbarossa. From 1941 to 1945, Allied merchant ships, escorted by naval vessels, braved the treacherous Arctic seas, battling icebergs, hurricane-force winds, and near-constant darkness to deliver desperately needed tanks, aircraft, fuel, and supplies to the Soviet ports of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. It was arguably the most perilous route of the war. German U-boats, surface raiders like the Scharnhorst, and Luftwaffe bombers relentlessly attacked these convoys, turning the icy waters into a graveyard of ships and men. Convoy PQ-17 in July 1942 suffered catastrophic losses after being ordered to scatter, with 24 out of 35 merchant ships sunk. But the Arctic was more than just a convoy route. It was a battleground for critical resources. Northern Norway and its fjords became a crucial German naval base, threatening Atlantic shipping. Further east, the nickel mines of Pechenga, Petsamo, and the iron ore deposits of Kirkens, vital for Germany's war machine, were fiercely contested. Allied raids and commando operations targeted these sites, while a relentless meteorological war was fought, with both sides establishing secret weather stations on remote Arctic islands to gain crucial forecasting advantages for air and sea operations. Soldiers and sailors faced unimaginable conditions: frostbite, hypothermia, endless nights, and the crushing psychological toll of constant threat in a featureless, frozen expanse. The contributions of Norwegian and Soviet Arctic regions, often overshadowed by larger fronts, were immense. Without the supplies delivered through these brutal convoys, the Soviet war effort, particularly in its darkest hours, would have been severely hampered. This was a war fought in the shadows and the blizzards, a testament to human endurance against both man and nature, proving that even in the most remote corners of the globe, the fate of nations could be decided. While the Arctic raged with icy fury, another vital, yet largely overlooked, theater of war unfolded across the scorching deserts and dense jungles of Africa. Often marginalized in Western narratives, the African fronts were pivotal, from Italy's aggressive imperial ambitions to the immense contributions and brutal sacrifices of colonial troops, whose stories remain largely untold. The seeds of conflict in Africa were sown long before 1939. In 1935, fascist Italy, under Mussolini, launched a brutal invasion of Ethiopia, an independent African nation and a member of the League of Nations. Haile Selassie, Ethiopia's emperor, pleaded for international intervention, but the world's response was timid, revealing the hypocrisy of European powers and emboldening aggressors like Hitler. For 5 years, Ethiopians fought a valiant, though ultimately outmatched, resistance against Italian occupation, a struggle that predated the official start of World War II and foreshadowed the global conflict's moral ambiguities. When war formally erupted, Africa became a battleground in earnest. The East African Campaign, 1940 to 1941, saw British Commonwealth and Allied forces, predominantly drawn from African colonial units like the King's African Rifles, Gold Coast Regiment, and Nigerian Regiment, fight to liberate Ethiopia and dislodge Italian forces from Italian East Africa. These soldiers, often referred to as Askari, were not passive participants. They were crucial to Allied success. Thousands more from French West Africa, North Africa, and South Africa served in North Africa, the Middle East, and even in Europe, enduring brutal conditions, discriminatory pay, and often fighting for empires that denied them their own freedom. Their motivations were as diverse as their origins. Some were conscripted, others volunteered for economic reasons, seeking pay, food, or education. Many harbored hopes that their service would earn them greater rights or even independence for their homelands, a promise that was largely unfulfilled in the immediate post-war period. The realities of these campaigns were brutal. Disease, unforgiving terrain, and fierce combat claimed countless lives. Yet, their courage and resilience were undeniable. These African fronts, though often relegated to footnotes, were integral to the Allied war effort, diverting Axis resources and securing vital strategic positions. The sacrifices of these forgotten soldiers, from Emperor Haile Selassie's initial resistance to the colonial troops who bled on distant battlefields, remind us that the tapestry of World War II was woven with threads from every corner of the globe, and its legacy of struggle for self-determination deeply influenced the wave of decolonization that followed. As the war raged across continents, often dominating the narratives of Europe and the Pacific, one of the greatest, yet least acknowledged, forces quietly rose from the heart of the British Empire. Far from the battlefields of Dunkirk or the deserts of North Africa, a monumental military effort was underway in British India, driven by a complex tapestry of loyalty, economic necessity, and the nascent stirrings of nationalism. By the war's end, British India would raise the largest volunteer army in history, numbering a staggering 2.5 million men. These soldiers, drawn from diverse communities, Sikhs, Gurkhas, Muslims, Hindus, would serve with distinction and immense sacrifice across virtually every theater of the war. From the scorching deserts of North Africa and the fierce battles for El Alamein, where they played a pivotal role against Rommel's Afrika Korps, to the brutal mountain warfare of Italy at Monte Cassino and the unforgiving jungles of Burma against the Japanese, Indian troops fought with unparalleled bravery. Their motivations were varied. For some, it was a deep sense of loyalty to the crown. For others, the steady pay provided a lifeline for their families in a land plagued by poverty. And for a significant number, service offered a unique opportunity to gain military experience, with some harboring the secret hope that their contributions might hasten India's path to independence. Yet, this immense contribution came at a devastating cost. Over 87,000 Indian soldiers lost their lives, and countless more were wounded. Their valor, however, was often overshadowed by the colonial narrative, and their sacrifices largely forgotten in the immediate post-war period as India navigated its own tumultuous path to partition and independence. The Indian Army's role was not just one of manpower. It was a strategic bulwark, tying down enemy forces and securing vital supply lines. Their story is a powerful reminder that the Allied effort was truly global, built on the often unseen shoulders of millions from nations struggling under the very empires they fought to defend. While the world often points to December 7th, 1941, and the attack on Pearl Harbor as the genesis of the Pacific War, the brutal reality on the ground paints a far earlier, bloodier picture. The true opening salvo of this devastating theater of conflict detonated 4 years prior, on July 7th, 1937, with the Marco Polo Bridge incident, escalating into Japan's full-scale invasion of China. This wasn't merely a skirmish. It was the Second Sino-Japanese War, a protracted, agonizing struggle that would claim tens of millions of Chinese lives and forever alter the nation's destiny. For 8 harrowing years, China, under the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government and later, in an uneasy truce, Mao Zedong's communists, bore the brunt of Japan's expansionist brutality. The invasion saw unparalleled atrocities, including the infamous Nanjing Massacre in late 1937, where hundreds of thousands of civilians and disarmed soldiers were systematically murdered and raped. Japanese forces employed scorched earth tactics, chemical warfare, and biological warfare, turning vast swaths of the Chinese heartland into desolate landscapes of suffering. Cities like Shanghai, Wuhan, and Chongqing endured relentless bombing campaigns. Yet the Chinese resistance, though often outmatched in technology and firepower, never truly broke. This epic, forgotten struggle was strategically vital. China, a vast nation enduring immense pain, became a colossal quagmire for Imperial Japan, tying down millions of Japanese troops and preventing their deployment to other fronts. While the Western allies were initially hesitant to fully intervene, distracted by Europe, China's tenacity bought crucial time and diverted resources that might otherwise have been unleashed across the Pacific. The untold stories of Chinese sacrifice, the silent screams from a nation under siege, highlight a crucial truth. World War II was not a series of isolated events, but an interconnected global catastrophe, and China's 8-year ordeal stands as a testament to humanity's capacity for both immense suffering and indomitable will. From China's protracted struggle, the gaze of Japanese expansionism turned southeast, sweeping across Southeast Asia and into the Pacific. Here, Another crucial, often overlooked chapter of wartime suffering unfolded in the Philippines. Following the devastating fall of Bataan and Corregidor in May 1942 and the subsequent horrors of the Bataan Death March, the Philippine Islands were plunged into 3 years of brutal Japanese occupation. This period was defined by widespread atrocities, forced labor, and an insidious campaign to erase American influence and impose Japanese rule. Yet, the spirit of the Filipino people refused to be extinguished. Throughout the archipelago, a tenacious and widespread resistance movement emerged, often operating in the dense jungles and remote villages. Led by figures like Luis Turuk of the Hikbalahap, as well as numerous other guerrilla leaders, these irregular forces tied down thousands of Japanese troops, sabotaged supply lines, gathered intelligence, and provided vital safe havens for Allied prisoners and downed airmen. The decision to resist came with immense personal risk. Captured guerrillas and their families faced unimaginable torture and execution, turning every act of defiance into a profound gamble for life itself. This complex relationship with the United States, their colonial power, added another layer of ambiguity. While General Douglas MacArthur famously promised, "I shall return upon his evacuation," the initial abandonment felt like a betrayal to many Filipinos who had fought shoulder to shoulder with American troops. This sense of being left to fend for themselves fueled a fierce self-reliance, but also led to difficult moral choices, as some Filipinos were forced into collaboration to survive, creating deep societal fissures that would long outlast the war. The Philippines ordeal, a testament to suffering, courage, and the ambiguous legacy of colonial ties, reminds us that liberation, when it finally arrived in 1945, came at an almost unbearable human cost, a price paid by a people often forgotten in the grander narratives of victory. From the crucible of the Pacific and Asia, the global conflict's tendrils extended even to the seemingly distant shores of Latin America. Often overlooked in narratives dominated by European and Asian fronts, the nations of Central and South America played a surprisingly critical and multifaceted role in World War II. Their involvement wasn't always on the battlefield, but it was essential, demonstrating the truly global nature of the struggle against the Axis powers. Strategically, Latin America was a vital source of raw materials for the Allied war machine. Mexico and Venezuela supplied crucial oil. Chile provided vast quantities of copper. Brazil offered rubber, quartz, and strategic minerals. These resources were lifelines, fueling factories and armies across the globe, and their uninterrupted flow was paramount. The region's geography itself was critical, with the Panama Canal serving as a strategic artery connecting the Atlantic and Pacific, and the vast coastline becoming a battleground against menacing German U-boats. But the war also reached Latin America in more insidious ways. Axis espionage was rampant, with German and Japanese spy networks operating across the continent, particularly in neutral nations like Argentina and in Brazil, attempting to gather intelligence and disrupt Allied shipping. In response, many Latin American nations, including Mexico, Brazil, and Cuba, actively participated in anti-submarine warfare, patrolling their coastal waters and safeguarding vital convoys. Mexico, in particular, sent the Escuadron 201 or Aztec Eagles, an air fighter squadron, to fight in the Pacific theater, embodying a direct combat contribution. By the war's end, almost all Latin American countries had severed ties with or declared war on the Axis, a testament to their alignment with the Allied cause and their understanding of the existential threat posed by fascism. This complex web of resource provision, counter-espionage, naval patrols, and even direct combat demonstrates that the sacrifices and strategic importance of Latin America were far from marginal, an unwritten chapter in the larger story of a world united against tyranny. From the broad strategic involvement of Latin America, one nation stands out for its uniquely direct combat contribution to the European theater: Brazil. While many South American nations contributed vital resources and defended their coasts, Brazil alone dispatched a full-ground contingent to fight alongside the Allies in Europe. This was the Força Expedicionária Brasileira, or FEB, affectionately known as the smoking cobras after a popular saying that it's easier for a snake to smoke than for the FEB to go to war. Comprising over 25,000 men, the FEB arrived in Italy in mid-1944, a tropical army suddenly thrust into the harsh realities of European winter warfare. Attached to the U.S. Fifth Army, they were tasked with the arduous mission of breaking through the formidable German Gothic line in the Apennine Mountains, a brutal landscape of unforgiving terrain and entrenched enemy positions. The Brazilians, many of whom had never experienced cold weather, adapted quickly, demonstrating remarkable resilience and courage. They fought alongside American, British, and other Allied forces in grueling battles, enduring heavy shelling, fierce resistance, and bitter conditions. Their most notable engagements included the bloody capture of Monte Castello in February 1945, a strategic peak fiercely defended by German forces. The Cobras faced repeated setbacks before finally securing the objective, a victory bought at high price. They also played crucial roles in the liberation of towns like Montes and La Serra, and ultimately participated in the final Allied offensive that led to the collapse of German resistance in Italy. The FEB suffered nearly 465 killed in action, with thousands more wounded, missing, or taken prisoner. Brazil's contribution, often forgotten in the shadow of larger Allied armies, was a significant testament to their commitment to the global fight against fascism. Their sacrifices in the Apennines underscored the universal nature of the war, proving that even a nation far removed from Europe's traditional battlefields would answer the call, leaving an indelible mark on the landscape of freedom. As the war entered its crucial middle years, the call for Allied strength echoed across the Atlantic, where the Commonwealth nations continued to play an indispensable, yet often understated, role. While Canada's valor on Juno Beach during D-Day is widely celebrated, its contributions extend far beyond that pivotal day, encompassing a grueling progression of battles, a titanic naval struggle, and a profound transformation on the home front. Canada paid a truly heavy price for victory, often in battles that remain obscured by the sheer scale of the war. One such early, searing experience was the Dieppe raid in August 1942. This disastrous reconnaissance in force, designed to test German defenses, cost over 900 Canadian lives and saw thousands more captured or wounded. While a brutal learning experience for the Allies, it highlighted Canadian courage under fire and provided vital lessons for future amphibious landings. Beyond Dieppe, Canada's war was fought across the globe. The Royal Canadian Navy, RCN, became the third-largest Allied navy by 1945, playing a crucial, relentless role in the Battle of the Atlantic, escorting vital convoys through treacherous U-boat-infested waters. These corvette sailors ensured that the lifelines to Britain remained open, an endless, deadly dance between destroyer and submarine. In the air, the Royal Canadian Air Force, RCF, distinguished itself in bombing campaigns over Germany, air defense, and support roles. Canada also hosted the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, turning vast prairies into an aviation schoolhouse for tens of thousands of Allied airmen. On the home front, Canadian industry pivoted dramatically to war production, manufacturing everything from munitions to tanks and ships, with women stepping into roles previously unimaginable. This rapid industrialization, combined with a contentious conscription crisis, reshaped Canadian society forever. From the mud of Sicily and Italy to the beaches of Normandy and the skies over Europe, Canada's sacrifice, numbering over 45,000 dead from a small population, was immense, a silent testament to a nation that punched far above its weight in the global fight for freedom. Following Canada's profound global contributions, we turn our attention to the antipodes, where Australia and New Zealand faced a uniquely agonizing dilemma. As loyal members of the British Commonwealth, their forces were among the first to answer the call. Fighting valiantly in the desert campaigns of North Africa, at Tobruk and El Alamein, and enduring brutal struggles in Greece and Crete. Their courage and resilience earned them a fearsome reputation, Yet as Japan's shadow lengthened across the Pacific, their strategic priorities were thrown into stark and terrifying relief. The fall of Singapore in February 1942, followed by the bombing of Darwin and the audacious midget submarine attack on Sydney Harbor, brought the war directly to Australia's shores. The fear of invasion became a palpable reality, giving rise to the Brisbane Line, a largely hypothetical defense plan envisioning the abandonment of vast northern territories to concentrate defenses further south. This existential threat forced both nations to make an agonizing choice: continue to support the mother country in distant Europe, or recall their battle-hardened troops to defend their homelands. In a dramatic pivot, Australian and New Zealand forces were recalled from the European and North African theaters to confront the immediate Japanese threat. They fought with extraordinary tenacity in the unforgiving jungles of New Guinea, particularly along the Kokoda Track, a brutal, hand-to-hand struggle against a relentless enemy. The fighting here, often overlooked, was some of the fiercest of the entire Pacific War, critical in halting the Japanese advance towards Australia. This strategic shift also cemented a new alliance, as General Douglas MacArthur established his headquarters in Brisbane, transforming Australia into a crucial base for the Allied counteroffensive in the Pacific. Australia and New Zealand's war was thus fought on two distant and equally vital fronts, balancing imperial loyalty with national survival. Their sacrifices, from the sands of Tobruk to the muddy tracks of Kokoda, underscore the profound global impact of the conflict and the immense challenges faced by nations forced to defend their very existence, while contributing to a broader fight for freedom. As we unravel the complex tapestry of World War II, we must confront its darkest, most unimaginable chapter: the Holocaust. The systematic extermination of 6 million Jewish people by the Nazi regime stands as a singular atrocity, an unparalleled act of genocide that remains paramount in our collective memory. Yet, to fully comprehend the depth of Nazi depravity and the horror they unleashed, it is crucial to recognize that the architects of the final solution extended their murderous ideology far beyond the Jewish community, targeting millions of others deemed undesirable or enemies of the state. Among these forgotten victims were the Roma, or Romani people, for whom the Nazis devised a parallel genocide known as the Parajmos, the Devouring. An estimated 250,000 to 500,000 Roma were systematically murdered, rounded up, subjected to forced sterilization, and gassed in extermination camps, their vibrant culture deemed an inferior race to be eradicated. Disabled individuals, encompassing both adults and children, were targeted under the chilling Action T4 euthanasia program, where hundreds of thousands were deemed unworthy of life and killed through lethal injection, gas, or forced starvation, long before the concentration camps were fully operational. Homosexuals, identified by the infamous Pink Triangle, faced brutal persecution, imprisonment in concentration camps, forced castration, and medical experimentation, systematically stripped of their dignity and lives. Political dissidents, including communists, socialists, trade unionists, and anyone openly opposing the Nazi regime, were rounded up and sent to camps. Jehovah's Witnesses, due to their pacifist stance and refusal to swear loyalty to Hitler, also faced severe persecution and death. Furthermore, the Nazis' genocidal ambitions extended to Slavic peoples, particularly Poles and Russians, whom they considered subhuman and intended to annihilate or enslave through policies like General Plan Ost, resulting in the deaths of millions of civilians and prisoners of war. These lesser-known victims remind us that the Holocaust was not an isolated act, but a multifaceted campaign of terror, a chilling vision of racial purity and political control. Remembering all who suffered under the swastika is not to diminish the unique horror faced by the Jewish people, but to deepen our understanding of the scope of Nazi evil, ensuring that the stories of all victims echo through history, preventing such systematic hatred from ever taking root again. World War II's shadow stretches far beyond the battlefields, casting a long, dark pall over the lives of ordinary people. While the Holocaust rightly commands our attention for its unspeakable atrocities, Another vast human tragedy unfolded across Eastern Europe, largely forgotten in Western narratives: the forced displacement and ethnic cleansing of millions. As the war drew to a close and its immediate aftermath, the map of Europe was not merely redrawn. Its very human fabric was violently restitched. The Potsdam Agreement in 1945, coupled with national decrees like the Beneš decrees in Czechoslovakia, sanctioned the expulsion of ethnic German populations from newly expanded Poland, Czechoslovakia, and other territories. From regions like Silesia, East Prussia, Pomerania, and the Sudetenland, some 12 to 14 million Germans, many of whom had lived in these lands for centuries, were uprooted. Their journey was one of unimaginable hardship, packed into cattle cars, forced to march for hundreds of miles, subjected to violence, starvation, and exposure. Over 2 million perished during these brutal expulsions, a catastrophic loss often overshadowed by other wartime tragedies. But the suffering was not confined to Germans. Poles, whose country had been savaged by both Nazi and Soviet aggression, faced their own cruel calculus. Hundreds of thousands were forcibly relocated from the Kresy region, annexed by the Soviet Union, to the recovered territories in the West, emptied of their German inhabitants. Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Lithuanians also endured forced population transfers, caught between shifting borders and competing nationalisms. Homes were lost, communities shattered, and identities fractured by political fiat. The scale of this demographic engineering was unprecedented, a brutal attempt to create ethnically homogeneous nation-states from a mosaic of peoples. These were not refugees fleeing war. These are populations expelled as a consequence of war, their fates sealed by victors eager to secure new geopolitical realities. Their stories are a poignant testament to the war's capacity for destruction, not just of buildings and lives, but of entire ways of life, leaving behind a legacy of trauma and unresolved historical grievances that would echo through the Cold War and beyond. The silent suffering of these millions serves as a stark reminder that the human cost of conflict extends far beyond the final surrender. From the profound human migrations spurred by war, we turn to the incredible, often terrifying, acceleration of human ingenuity. World War II was not just a clash of armies. It was a crucible of scientific innovation, pushing the boundaries of what was thought possible and birthing technologies that would shape the 20th century and beyond. Driven by the existential stakes of conflict, scientists worked in secret, under immense pressure, forever altering the landscape of warfare and daily life. Perhaps no invention transformed aerial and naval combat more profoundly than radar. Building on pre-war experiments, British scientists like Sir Robert Watson-Watt developed the chain home system, critical during the Battle of Britain. But it was the cavity magnetron, developed by John Randall and Harry Boot at the University of Birmingham in 1940, that truly revolutionized radar. This tiny device generated microwaves, enabling compact, powerful airborne radar units, allowing Allied night fighters to see German bombers in the dark and U-boats lurking beneath the waves. It was a technological leap, turning the invisible visible, giving the Allies a decisive edge. Yet, the Axis powers were equally engaged in groundbreaking, if more destructive, research. Germany's V-weapons program, led by figures like Wernher von Braun, unleashed the world's first ballistic missiles. The V-2 rocket, developed at Piemont, was a terrifying harbinger of the space age. Launched from mobile platforms, it traveled at supersonic speeds, striking London and Antwerp without warning, beyond any defense. Though ultimately failing to change the war's outcome, the V-2 laid the groundwork for intercontinental ballistic missiles and space exploration, demonstrating the dual nature of scientific progress. And then there were the early computers. Hidden away at Bletchley Park, the Colossus machine, developed by Tommy Flowers, was instrumental in breaking complex German Lorenz cipher messages. In America, the ENIAC, built at the University of Pennsylvania, calculated artillery firing tables with unprecedented speed. These weren't the sleek devices we know today, but immense room-sized machines of vacuum tubes and wires, buzzing with nascent intelligence. They were primitive, yet they represented the dawn of the digital age, born from the urgent necessity of cracking codes and calculating trajectories. The war, in its desperate grip, became the unlikely midwife to the digital revolution, forever connecting conflict to the future of technology. From the palpable impact of scientific weaponry, we descend into the clandestine world where the most potent weapons were not steel and fire, but intellect and mathematics. While the breaking of Germany's Enigma code at Bletchley Park is justly celebrated, it was but one front in a global war waged in the shadows. Across the Pacific, another equally crucial, yet often less acknowledged, intelligence battle raged, with profound strategic consequences. In the vast expanse of the Pacific, American codebreakers, primarily at Station HYPO in Hawaii, tirelessly worked to decipher Japan's complex cryptographic systems. Their greatest triumphs involved Purple, the diplomatic cipher machine, and Gen 25, the Japanese Imperial Navy's operational code. The Purple machine was an ingenious electromechanical device, similar in complexity to Enigma. Its decipherment, a feat accomplished by a team including William F. Friedman and Frank Rowlett, gave the Allies magic intelligence, invaluable insights into Japan's diplomatic intentions and military planning even before Pearl Harbor. But it was the breaking of Gen 25 that proved truly decisive. This naval code, far more complex and frequently changed than Enigma, allowed the Allies to anticipate Japanese fleet movements. The most dramatic example came in May 1942. Commander Joseph Rockefort and his team at Station HYPO, working under intense pressure, correctly predicted the target of the upcoming Japanese offensive, Midway Atoll. This unprecedented foresight allowed the vastly outnumbered American fleet to set a trap, leading to the pivotal Battle of Midway, a turning point in the Pacific War that effectively crippled Japan's carrier fleet and shifted the balance of power irrevocably. Allied code-breaking efforts extended beyond these major theaters, involving lesser-known but vital campaigns in the Mediterranean, Eastern Front, and even within the Axis powers themselves, who also attempted to penetrate Allied communications, albeit with less success. This intelligence war was fought with pencil and paper, with punch cards and nascent machines, by dedicated men and women often working in complete isolation and secrecy. Their triumphs and sacrifices, once buried in classified archives, reveal how profoundly the conflict was shaped not just by bombs and bullets, but by the silent, relentless struggle to understand the enemy's next move. From the shadows of code-breaking, we emerge into a different kind of hidden battlefield, the human mind itself. World War II was not merely a physical contest of territorial conquest. It was a profound struggle for hearts and minds, waged with words, images, and elaborate deceptions. All sides deployed sophisticated psychological warfare, understanding that demoralizing the enemy, bolstering one's own populace, and misleading military intelligence could be as crucial as any tank division. Propaganda permeated every aspect of life, from bombastic radio broadcasts designed to inspire fear or courage, to millions of leaflets dropped over enemy lines. The airwaves and skies were weaponized. Figures like Germany's Lord Haha, William Joyce, and Japan's Tokyo Rose, Iva Taguri became infamous voices, broadcasting demoralizing messages to Allied troops, though often with unintended effects. Conversely, Allied broadcasts, such as those from the BBC, aimed to provide hope and factual counter-narratives to occupied populations, fueling resistance. But psychological warfare went far beyond mere persuasion. It involved grand-scale deception. Operation Mincemeat, a brilliantly audacious British scheme in 1943, exemplifies this. Allied intelligence agents planted a briefcase on a corpse, disguised as a Royal Marines officer, allowing it to wash ashore in Spain. The briefcase contained fabricated documents suggesting an Allied invasion of Greece and Sardinia, instead of the actual target, Sicily. Hitler, convinced by the evidence, diverted vital German forces, significantly easing the Allied landings in Italy. It was a macabre, yet highly effective, game of wits. Equally elaborate was Operation Fortitude, the deception plan preceding D-Day. A phantom army, the first U.S. Army group, FUSAG, commanded by General George Patton, was convincingly stationed in southeast England, complete with dummy tanks made of inflatable rubber, fake airfields, and meticulous radio traffic. Hitler believed the main invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, holding back his armored reserves, while the real invasion force landed in Normandy. These were not minor tricks. They were meticulously planned, multi-layered operations involving thousands of personnel, artists, radio specialists, and intelligence officers, all working to create an illusion. The war, therefore, was fought as much in the theater of the mind, with elaborate scripts and cunning misdirection, as it was on the beaches and battlefields, proving that perception could be a more powerful weapon than any bomb. From the grand deceptions waged on an international stage, we now turn inward, exploring the complex and often brutal realities within the very movement's history so often romanticizes, the resistance. While resistance fighters are rightly celebrated for their courage against tyranny, the struggle was rarely monolithic. Beneath the surface of unity against a common foe lay deep ideological fissures, turf wars, and brutal internal purges that left lasting scars on societies. Across occupied Europe, resistance movements were a diverse tapestry of communists, socialists, monarchists, nationalists, and various political factions. In Yugoslavia, the partisans, led by the communist Josip Broz Tito, waged a fierce war not only against the Axis occupiers, but also against rival resistance groups, most notably the royalist Chetniks, led by Draza Mihailovic. Their conflict, often more brutal than against the Germans, spiraled into a bloody civil war, culminating in the partisans' victory and a post-war purge of their perceived enemies. Similar internal struggles played out in Greece, where communist and anti-communist resistance factions battled each other, setting the stage for a devastating civil war after liberation. In France, while the image of a unified French resistance under Charles de Gaulle is potent, the reality was a collection of often disparate groups with varying political agendas. The liberation period saw spontaneous, often brutal, purges of suspected collaborators, many without due process. Summary executions, public humiliation, and intense score-settling occurred across the liberated territories, blurring the lines between justice and revenge. These internal conflicts were fueled by deep-seated political differences, competition for Allied aid, and the struggle for post-war power. The fight against occupation was a crucible that hardened ideologies, fostering paranoia and ruthlessness. The dark side of resistance movements reveals that liberation often came at a steep price, not just from the occupiers, but from within. The brother-against-brother conflicts and the subsequent purges laid foundations for decades of political instability and unresolved trauma. A stark reminder that even in the fight for freedom, humanity's darker impulses can tragically prevail. If the internal struggles of resistance movements reveal the moral ambiguities of fighting tyranny, then the phenomenon of collaboration forces us to confront an even more uncomfortable truth about human nature under extreme duress. Collaboration, far from being a simple act of villainy, was a spectrum of complex choices driven by survival, deep-seated ideology, and ruthless opportunism, often made an impossible. Circumstances. Across German-occupied Europe, collaboration took myriad forms. There are those who believe in the Nazi vision, ideologues like Vidkun Quisling in Norway, who willingly spearheaded puppet regimes. For them, collaboration was a conviction, often rooted in anti-communism or a desire for a new European order. Then there were individuals driven by raw opportunism, eager to exploit the power vacuum, betray neighbors for personal gain, or profit from economic ties to the occupation. But for millions, the lines were far blurrier. In countries like Vichy France, the regime, led by Marshal Pétain, presented collaboration as a means of national survival, a painful compromise to preserve some semblance of sovereignty and protect its people from the harsher realities of direct German administration. Everyday citizens faced agonizing choices: work in German factories to avoid starvation, or refuse and risk their families' lives, inform on a neighbor, or face lethal consequences. These were not choices made by villains, but by ordinary people trapped in an extraordinary, terrifying reality. Local police forces, civil servants, and administrators often continued their duties under occupation, a form of administrative collaboration essential for the functioning of society, yet inadvertently aiding the occupier. Some joined anti-Bolshevik units on the Eastern Front, motivated by a desire to fight communism, even if it meant aligning with Nazism. The motivations were often layered, a blend of fear, limited information, nationalistic sentiment, and the instinct for self-preservation. Understanding collaboration requires moving beyond simplistic condemnation to grapple with the profound moral dilemmas faced by individuals and communities when their world collapses. It forces us to ask, what would we do when survival itself becomes an act of compromise? From the individual moral mazes of collaboration, we turn to the institutional complexities of neutrality, embodied by the Vatican and Pope Pius XII during World War II. The Holy See, a sovereign state within Rome, adopted a stance of neutrality, a position fiercely debated then and now. Its role during the Holocaust, in particular, remains one of the war's most enduring controversies, a study in the intersection of moral authority and political pragmatism. Pope Pius XII, formerly Eugenio Pacelli, a seasoned diplomat, had a long history of dealing with German affairs, including negotiating the Reichskonkordat with Nazi Germany in 1933. When war erupted, his public statements maintained a careful neutrality, avoiding direct condemnation of Nazi atrocities. Critics argue this silence on the Holocaust allowed the systematic extermination of millions to proceed without the powerful moral voice of the Catholic Church. They point to the encyclical Summi Pontificatus, 1939, which condemned racism in general terms, but not Nazism by name, and the absence of a direct papal condemnation of the final solution, even as evidence mounted. However, supporters argue that Pius XII public neutrality was a strategic choice, designed to protect Catholics in occupied territories, maintain diplomatic channels, and prevent an even harsher crackdown on the Church by the Axis. They highlight the Vatican's extensive, albeit clandestine, humanitarian network. Nuncios and religious orders across Europe facilitated the rescue of thousands of Jews and others persecuted by the Nazis, providing false papers, shelter in monasteries and convents, and safe passage. Within Rome itself, during the German occupation, thousands of Jews found refuge in churches and Vatican institutions, often with the direct knowledge and approval of Pius XII. Moreover, the Vatican engaged in secret diplomatic efforts, using its channels to plead for prisoners of war and civilian populations. The debates over Pius XII's legacy continue to this day. Was his silence a moral failure, or a calculated act of diplomacy that saved more lives than open condemnation might have? The Vatican's wartime actions remain a poignant example of the profound dilemmas faced by even the most revered institutions when confronted by unprecedented evil, caught between the demands of moral imperative and the exigencies of realpolitik. Continuing our exploration of complex neutrality, we turn to a nation often synonymous with peace and independence: Switzerland. Tucked away in the heart of Europe, the Alpine nation maintained its armed neutrality throughout World War II, a stance that allowed it to survive unscathed, yet one fraught with its own set of moral and practical compromises. Switzerland was not merely an observer. It was an indispensable, if often morally ambiguous, participant in the war's economic and intelligence landscapes. Geographically isolated and heavily fortified, Switzerland was prepared to defend its borders against any invader, famously constructing the Redraw National, a network of impregnable bunkers and tunnels deep within the Alps. This formidable defense, combined with a credible threat of guerrilla warfare, deterred both Axis and Allied invasion plans. Yet this neutrality came with a price, and a benefit. Switzerland became a crucial financial hub for both sides. Its banks famously accepted vast amounts of gold from Nazi Germany, some of which was looted from occupied territories and Jewish victims. This Nazi gold allowed Germany to purchase vital war materials from other neutral countries, fueling its war machine. Simultaneously, Swiss banks managed assets for Allied powers and private individuals, making the country an indispensable, if ethically compromised, financial crossroads. The post-war controversies surrounding dormant Jewish assets highlighted the darker side of this financial neutrality. Beyond finance, Switzerland was a buzzing center for espionage. With representatives from all warring nations present, it became a hotbed of spy activity. Allied and Axis intelligence services constantly vied for information, often using Swiss territory as a neutral ground for meetings, exchanges, and clandestine operations. It was a place where information was bought and sold, where double agents thrived, and where the secret war was fought with silent intensity. Switzerland also served as a refuge for some 300,000 people, including interned Allied and Axis soldiers, and a limited number of civilian refugees, though its strict border policies, particularly concerning Jewish refugees, remain a point of significant criticism. Switzerland's neutrality was not an act of simple detachment, but a dynamic and complex balancing act, an exercise in strategic pragmatism that secured its survival, yet entangled it in the war's moral quagmire. Its story challenges the very definition of neutrality, revealing how even a non-combatant can be deeply enmeshed in the ethical and economic realities of a global conflict. As the fires of war consumed Europe, one nation walked a perilous tightrope, a masterclass in calculated neutrality. Sweden, strategically positioned and rich in vital resources, found itself caught between the hammer and the anvil. It was a neutrality born not just of pacifism, but of stark pragmatism, where survival demanded uncomfortable compromises that history often overlooks. From the very outbreak of hostilities, Sweden's high-grade iron ore became a lifeline for Hitler's war machine. The vast mines of Kiruna and Gallivare fed the hungry furnaces of German industry, forging the steel for tanks, U-boats, and artillery. Every year, millions of tons of this essential raw material traversed the perilous sea lanes from Narvik, Norway, or by rail directly through Sweden, making their way to the industrial heartland of the Third Reich. It was an economic lifeline Germany could ill afford to lose, and Sweden, a small nation surrounded by conflict, understood the unspoken threat woven into every trade agreement. But Sweden's neutrality was not monolithic. While its ore fueled the Axis, its quiet harbors and forests offered sanctuary. Jewish refugees fleeing the Holocaust, particularly from occupied Denmark, found a desperate haven within Swedish borders, spirited across the Øresund Strait in clandestine operations. Norwegian resistance fighters found safe passage and logistical support. Allied airmen, shot down over enemy territory, were often repatriated through Sweden. The Swedish intelligence apparatus, while officially neutral, engaged in covert intelligence gathering, often sharing insights with the Allies. They even permitted the establishment of Allied observation posts on their territory and provided training facilities for Norwegian and Danish forces in exile. This intricate dance of appeasement and defiance was a constant balancing act. The transit traffic agreements, allowing German soldiers to travel through Sweden to and from Norway, were a particularly bitter pill, a symbol of the moral price paid for self-preservation. Yet, without these concessions, Sweden faced the very real threat of invasion, a fate it desperately sought to avoid. The decisions made in Stockholm were not those of clear moral absolutes, but of desperate necessities, demonstrating how even in a global war of good versus evil, national survival could force a nation into the most profound and ethically complex compromises. These are the uncomfortable truths that reveal the war's true depth, reminding us that survival often comes at a cost, a lesson, etched into the fabric of a nation that managed to stay out of the firing line, but not out of the moral crosshairs. While Sweden grappled with its moral compass, across the Atlantic, the United States plunged headlong into the war, transforming its industrial might into an arsenal of democracy. But the narrative of the American home front often narrows to iconic images like Rosie the Riveter, overlooking a far more complex and diverse tapestry of sacrifice and struggle. Beneath the surface of national unity, millions of unsung heroes, women, African Americans, Native Americans, and other minorities, fought a dual war, one against the Axis powers abroad, and another against prejudice and inequality at home. With millions of men overseas, the demand for labor became insatiable. Women, previously confined to domestic roles or lower-paying women's work, surged into factories, shipyards, and aircraft plants. They became welders, mechanics, crane operators, producing everything from munitions to B-29 bombers. These were not just Rosies. They were women of all backgrounds, shattering gender barriers with every shift, proving their capabilities in roles previously deemed impossible for them. Their contributions were indispensable, yet their fight for equal pay and respect often continued even as they built the tools of victory. African Americans, despite facing systemic segregation and discrimination, responded to the call to arms with unwavering patriotism. The Double V campaign, Victory Abroad, Victory at Home, symbolized their resolve to fight fascism overseas while simultaneously battling racism within their own borders. They poured into industrial cities, working in vital war industries, often in segregated facilities, but their labor was critical. The March for Civil Rights, though decades from its peak, gained crucial momentum from their wartime experiences and sacrifices, highlighting the hypocrisy of fighting for freedom abroad while denying it to a significant portion of its own citizenry. Beyond these, forgotten voices often include the Mexican Americans who worked tirelessly in agriculture and industry, sustaining the nation's food supply and filling manufacturing gaps. Native Americans, too, contributed significantly, not only in specialized military roles like the famed Code Talkers, but also on the home front in factories and farms. These diverse groups, facing systemic prejudice and often paid less, nonetheless stepped up, their stories of resilience and vital contribution forming the backbone of the American war effort, quietly reshaping the nation's social and economic landscape, laying groundwork for future movements for equality and justice that would redefine America for generations to come. Their sacrifice ensured victory, but their struggle for recognition continues to resonate. The narrative of sacrifice on the home front, however, carries with it a dark shadow, a profound betrayal of the very ideals America claimed to be fighting for. Following the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, a wave of hysteria, fear, and deeply entrenched racial prejudice swept across the United States and Canada. This wasn't a fight for freedom. It was a surrender to fear, culminating in one of the most shameful chapters in North American history, the forced internment of Japanese and Japanese-descended citizens. In the United States, Executive Order 9066, signed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt in February 1942, authorized the removal of over 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast. Two-thirds of them were Nisei, American citizens by birth, with no proven disloyalty. They were given mere days or weeks to sell their homes, businesses, and possessions, often at fire sale prices, before being forcibly relocated to desolate, barbed wire enclosed camps like Manzanar, Topaz, and Heart Mountain, situated in remote desert and swamp regions. Families were ripped from their communities, their lives uprooted, their rights stripped away. They lived under armed guard, their only crime being their ancestry. Canada, too, succumbed to this same racist paranoia. Following Pearl Harbor, and with significant economic rivalry fueling anti-Asian sentiment in British Columbia, over 22,000 Japanese Canadians, 75% of whom were naturalized or Canadian-born citizens, were likewise stripped of their rights. Their property, fishing boats, and businesses were confiscated and sold off by the government, often without consent or fair compensation. They were then forcibly moved to remote interior camps in British Columbia, their communities dismantled their livelihoods destroyed. Even after the war ended, many were still deemed undesirable and given the stark choice: move east of the Rockies or face deportation to war-torn Japan, a country many had never seen. The trauma was immense and long-lasting. Generations bore the scars of injustice, loss of dignity, and a profound realization that their citizenship offered little protection against xenophobia. Decades later, both nations would issue formal apologies and offer token reparations, but the damage was irreversible. This forced removal stands as a chilling testament to how easily democratic principles can be eroded by wartime hysteria and prejudice, a stark reminder that even nations fighting for freedom can fall prey to internal oppression, leaving a deep, unhealed wound in the heart of their own democratic fabric. The internment of Japanese citizens, while a profound stain on Western democracies, pales in comparison to the sheer scale of human catastrophe unfolding on the Eastern Front. Here, a war of unprecedented savagery claimed lives not in the tens or hundreds of thousands, but in the tens of millions. The Soviet Union's sacrifice in World War II remains a largely overlooked and underappreciated aspect of the global conflict, a testament to unimaginable suffering that redefined the very meaning of human cost. From June 1941, when Operation Barbarossa launched the Nazi invasion, the Soviet Union became the primary battleground, bearing the brunt of the Wehrmacht's might. The scorched earth tactics employed by both sides, coupled with Hitler's genocidal ideology of Lebensraum, living space, meant that civilians were not merely collateral damage, they were targets. Massacres like Babi Yar, where over 33,000 Jews were systematically executed in 2 days, were but a fraction of the atrocities committed by the Einsatzgruppen and the Wehrmacht across the vast Soviet territories. But beyond the battlefield and direct massacres, millions of Soviet citizens perished from famine, disease, and the brutal conditions of occupation. The siege of Leningrad, lasting an agonizing 872 days from September 1941 to January 1944, stands as one of history's longest and most devastating sieges. Over 1 million civilians died, primarily from starvation and exposure, their only sustenance often bitter bread made from sawdust and other desperate ingredients. Entire families froze or starved to death in their apartments, the city a ghost town of skeletal figures. And amidst this external terror, Stalin's internal repressions continued. The Gulag system, already a vast network of forced labor camps, remained active, its prisoners dying by the thousands even as the nation fought for its very existence. Suspected traitors, deserters, or simply those deemed unreliable were purged, adding to the already staggering death toll. Estimates vary, but the consensus points to a staggering 20 to 27 million Soviet lives lost, over half of whom were civilians. This figure dwarfs the casualties of all other Allied nations combined. It's a number almost too vast to comprehend, a profound silence etched into the landscape of a nation that sacrificed generations to defeat Nazism, a legacy of suffering that fundamentally shaped its post-war trajectory and the world that emerged from the ashes. The unparalleled human cost borne by the Soviet Union and the eventual Allied victory irrevocably altered the map of Europe. The war's end was not a simple return to normalcy. It triggered a seismic redrawing of national borders, a chaotic and often brutal process that displaced millions, shattered ancient communities, and sowed the seeds of new ethnic tensions. This vast, forced migration remains one of the most profound and least understood consequences of World War II. At the Potsdam Conference in 1945, the victorious powers, primarily the US, UK, and USSR, agreed to significant territorial adjustments, particularly affecting Germany and Poland. Germany lost vast swathes of its eastern territories, including East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia, which were transferred to Poland and the Soviet Union. This meant the expulsion of millions of ethnic Germans who had lived in these regions for centuries. Suddenly, their homes were no longer theirs, their language no longer welcome. Between 12 and 14 million Germans were forcibly moved, often under harsh conditions, westward into what remained of Germany, a brutal irony given Nazi Germany's own policies of ethnic cleansing. Poland itself underwent a dramatic westward shift. It gained former German territories in the west but lost its eastern lands to the Soviet Union, including cities like Lviv and Vilnius, which had long been part of Polish cultural identity. This created a new humanitarian crisis. Millions of ethnic Poles from the east were themselves forcibly resettled into the newly acquired Western territories, often moving into the homes vacated by expelled Germans. It was a cruel domino effect, a massive population exchange driven by geopolitical convenience, creating a new Poland, both geographically and demographically. Similar, though smaller, population transfers occurred across Central and Eastern Europe. Czechoslovakia expelled its Sudeten German minority, while Hungary saw its borders redefined, leading to further displacements. These changes, often justified as a means to prevent future conflicts by creating more ethnically homogeneous states, instead generated immense suffering, statelessness, and deep-seated resentments that would fester for decades. The map of Europe, once fluid and shifting, was now carved with new lines, each one representing not just a political boundary, but a shattered life, a lost homeland, and a profound, permanent shift in the continent's human and political geography. The war might have ended, but its human upheaval was far from over. The reshaped world, scarred by millions of displaced souls, was now entering a new, chilling phase. The alliances forged in the crucible of war rapidly dissolved, replaced by a desperate scramble for strategic advantage. In this nascent Cold War, the spoils of victory included not just territory, but intellect. And here, another profound moral compromise was made, one that saw the United States embrace some of its former enemies, Operation Paperclip. Operation Paperclip was a top-secret program by the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, initiated in the waning days of World War II and intensifying immediately after. Its objective, to whisk away Germany's most brilliant scientific minds, particularly those involved in rocketry, aeronautics, and medical research, to the United States. The driving force was simple: prevent these invaluable assets from falling into Soviet hands, and leverage their expertise for American strategic superiority. Among the most infamous beneficiaries of Paperclip was Wernher von Braun, the architect of Hitler's dreaded V-2 rocket program. Von Braun and his team, responsible for developing the weapon that terrorized London and Antwerp, were instrumental figures in a regime that relied on slave labor. Indeed, the V-2 rockets were built in underground factories like Dora Mittelbau, where concentration camp prisoners were worked to death in horrifying conditions. Yet, von Braun and hundreds of other German scientists and engineers, some with documented Nazi Party affiliations, were granted new identities, sanitized pasts, and passage to America. Their denazification was often a superficial formality, brushed aside in the desperate race against the Soviets. The ethical implications were staggering. The very nation that had fought to defeat Nazism now welcomed its scientific elite, prioritizing military advantage over moral integrity. These scientists, whose innovations have been forged in the crucible of human suffering, now laid the groundwork for America's space program, its intercontinental ballistic missile technology, and advancements that would define the latter half of the 20th century. Project Paperclip was a stark testament to the ruthless pragmatism of the emerging Cold War, a chilling illustration of how quickly wartime enemies could become Cold War assets, and how easily a nation could compromise its values in pursuit of power. It set the stage for a new kind of conflict, one fought not on battlefields, but in laboratories and on launch pads. The recruitment of Nazi scientists under Operation Paperclip was a symptom, a stark manifestation, of a far deeper and more insidious tension brewing among the wartime allies. While the world celebrated victory, the very conferences intended to chart a peaceful post-war future instead became the breeding grounds for the next global conflict, the Cold War. The seeds of this ideological clash were sown in the grand halls of Yalta and Potsdam, where the veneer of Allied unity began to crack under the weight of divergent ambitions and deepening mistrust. In February 1945, with victories seemingly within reach, the Big Three, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin, met in Yalta, Crimea. They discussed the fate of post-war Europe, the division of Germany, and the establishment of a United Nations. On the surface, agreements were reached, but beneath the diplomatic smiles, fundamental disagreements over Eastern Europe, particularly Poland, festered. Stalin, determined to create a buffer zone of friendly states, clashed with Western ideals of self-determination and free elections. The future of a divided Germany, occupied by the victorious powers, was agreed upon in principle, but the specifics were left dangerously vague. Just 5 months later, in July 1945, as the war in the Pacific raged on, the leaders reconvened at Potsdam, Germany. But the dynamic had shifted dramatically. Roosevelt was dead, replaced by the more assertive Harry S. Truman. Churchill was replaced midway through the conference by Clement Attlee, following a British election loss. And crucially, America had successfully tested its first atomic bomb just days before Potsdam began, fundamentally altering the balance of power. Truman, emboldened by this new weapon, took a firmer stance against Stalin's ambitions, deepening the Soviet leaders' suspicions of Western intentions. The Potsdam Conference cemented the division of Germany and laid the groundwork for Soviet control over much of Eastern Europe, solidifying what Churchill would famously describe as an iron curtain descending across the continent. The ideological chasm between capitalist democracies and communist totalitarianism widened irrevocably. Mutual suspicion, fear of expansion, and profound differences in political philosophy transformed wartime allies into wary adversaries. The world watched as the victory over Nazism, instead of ushering in an era of peace, paradoxically birthed a new era of global tension and proxy conflicts, defined by nuclear shadowboxing and the enduring legacy of unfulfilled promises made in the glow of fleeting triumph. In the shadow of the looming Cold War, with its newly drawn borders and ideological chasms, humanity made a desperate, yet hopeful, attempt to prevent another catastrophic global conflict. Born from the ashes of World War II and the spectacular failure of its predecessor, the League of Nations, the United Nations was envisioned as a beacon of peace, a forum for dialogue, and a champion of universal human rights. Yet, even at its inception, it was a creature of compromise, riddled with the very hypocrisies and limitations that would haunt its mission for decades. The UN Charter was signed in San Francisco in June 1945, imbued with a lofty rhetoric of collective security, self-determination, and fundamental freedoms. 50 nations came together, unified by the urgent need to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. It was a moment of profound idealism, a commitment to global cooperation that resonated deeply with a war-weary world. The General Assembly, representing all member states, would be a global parliament, while the Security Council, with its permanent members, would hold the real power to enforce peace. But here lay the inherent contradiction. The 5 permanent members of the Security Council, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, China, and the Soviet Union, were granted absolute veto power. This meant that any one of these major powers could block any substantive resolution, effectively kneecapping the organization's ability to act decisively, particularly when their own interests, or those of their allies, were at stake. This was the pragmatic concession made to ensure the buy-in of the most powerful nations, but it ensured that the UN would be perpetually paralyzed by the very ideological clashes it sought to mediate. Furthermore, while the UN championed self-determination, many of its founding members, including the UK, France, and the Netherlands, still maintained vast colonial empires, a glaring hypocrisy that would take decades of struggle to dismantle. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, was a monumental achievement on paper, but its enforcement often clashed with the political realities of state sovereignty and the Cold War's power plays. The UN, therefore, began its life with a noble mission but a flawed blueprint. It was a testament to humanity's aspirations, yet also a mirror reflecting the enduring power dynamics, the unresolved conflicts, and the unfulfilled promises that continue to shape a world still grappling with the legacies of its greatest war. The dream of a truly united world remained, and perhaps still remains, an elusive ideal. The echoes of freedom, shouted from the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific, rang with a cruel irony in the ears of millions. While the Allied powers championed democracy and self-determination against totalitarian regimes, vast swathes of their own empires remained in shackles. World War II, a war fought for liberation, paradoxically became the ultimate catalyst for the undoing of global colonialism. The conflict didn't just devastate cities. It shattered the very foundations of imperial power. Europe's great empires, Britain, France, the Netherlands, emerged from the war economically crippled and morally compromised. Their resources have been drained, their infrastructure often in ruins, and their prestige severely tarnished. The illusion of colonial invincibility, meticulously crafted over centuries, evaporated under the weight of German tanks and Japanese warships. When Singapore, the jewel of the British Empire, fell to Japan in 1942, it wasn't just a military defeat. It was a psychological blow that reverberated across Asia, demonstrating that European powers were not, in fact, invincible gods. Across Asia and Africa, nationalist movements, long simmering under colonial rule, ignited with renewed fervor. Leaders like Mahatma Gandhi in India, Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, and Sukarno in Indonesia saw their moment. They had witnessed European powers begging their colonial subjects for manpower and resources, promising a better future if they joined the fight against fascism. Yet, when victory was secured, the old order sought to reassert itself. But the genie of independence was out of the bottle. Soldiers from these colonies, having fought side by side with Europeans against tyranny, returned home with new skills, a broadened worldview, and an unwavering conviction that their own nations deserved the same freedom they had just fought for abroad. The war had exposed the profound hypocrisy at the heart of the colonial project. How could nations claim to fight for freedom and human rights while simultaneously denying those very rights to their own subjects? The United States, though not a traditional colonial power in the European sense, emerged as a new global hegemon, its rhetoric often aligning with anti-colonial sentiment, even as its own geopolitical interests would soon shape new forms of influence. The stage was set for a dramatic reshaping of the global map, a domino effect of independence that would define the latter half of the 20th century. The sacrifices made in the global conflict were not just for the liberation of Europe, but inadvertently for the liberation of entire continents. The mushroom cloud that bloomed over Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and Nagasaki 3 days later marked the dawn of a terrifying new age. The immediate devastation, cities incinerated, tens of thousands vaporized, entire landscapes reduced to ash, is etched into our collective memory. But the true horror of the atomic bomb did not end with the blinding flash or the concussive blast. It lingered, a silent, invisible killer that continued to stalk its victims for decades. Radiation. The survivors, known as hibakusha, became unwilling participants in a grim, long-term experiment on the human cost of nuclear war. For those who miraculously survived the initial cataclysm, the nightmare was just beginning. Within days, weeks, and months, they succumbed to a terrifying array of symptoms: hair loss, internal hemorrhaging, chronic fatigue, severe burns that refused to heal, and a relentless onslaught of cancers: leukemia, thyroid, breast, lung, and salivary gland. Children born to survivors often displayed developmental issues and increased cancer risks, a chilling legacy passed down through generations. Their bodies, once vibrant, became living monuments to an unprecedented form of suffering, forever scarred by an enemy they could not see, smell, or touch. Beyond the agonizing physical toll, the atomic bombings ignited an ethical inferno that rages to this day. Was their use truly necessary to end the war? Advocates argue it saved countless American lives that would have been lost in a conventional invasion of mainland Japan. Critics contend that Japan was already on the verge of surrender, crippled by conventional bombing and a naval blockade, and that the bombs were a horrific experiment or a geopolitical power play aimed at the Soviet Union. The Trinity test in New Mexico, barely a month before Hiroshima, proved the bomb's destructive power. Was it then a moral imperative to unleash it on civilian populations? The sheer scale of indiscriminate slaughter, the targeted obliteration of entire cities, forced humanity to confront the terrifying moral abyss into which scientific progress could plunge us. The Hibakusha's stories, often suppressed or ignored in the immediate aftermath, became poignant testaments to human resilience and a stark warning against the folly of nuclear conflict. Their suffering continues to challenge the moral conscience of the world, reminding us that the echoes of those two devastating August days resonate far beyond the immediate blast, shaping not only geopolitical strategy, but also the very definition of modern warfare and the ethical boundaries of power. As the dust settled on the ruins of World War II, Europe lay prostrate, its industries shattered, its economies in tatters, its populations facing widespread hunger and destitution. The United States, emerging from the conflict as the undisputed global economic power, recognized the immense challenge and opportunity that lay before it. In 1947, Secretary of State George C. Marshall unveiled a radical initiative, the European Recovery Program, swiftly dubbed the Marshall Plan. Framed as an act of unparalleled humanitarian generosity, it offered billions of dollars in aid to rebuild war-torn European nations. But beneath its benevolent surface lay a shrewd geopolitical strategy, a critical weapon in the nascent Cold War. Officially, the Marshall Plan aimed to combat hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. Noble goals indeed. Between 1948 and 1952, the U.S. poured over $13 billion, equivalent to over $150 billion today, into 16 European countries. Factories roared back to life. Infrastructure was rebuilt, and agricultural output soared. The plan successfully stabilized Western European economies, fostered democratic institutions, and, perhaps most importantly, demonstrated the viability and benefits of capitalism. For nations like France, Italy, and West Germany, the influx of American capital provided not just materials and machinery, but a pathway to recovery and renewed hope. However, the Marshall Plan was never solely about altruism. Its unspoken, yet undeniable, objective was containment. The U.S. feared that the economic devastation and social unrest gripping post-war Europe would create fertile ground for the spread of communism. Starving populations, disillusioned by the failures of capitalism, might readily embrace the promises of Soviet-backed socialist movements. By rebuilding and strengthening Western European economies, the Marshall Plan created a bulwark against Soviet influence, making communist ideologies far less appealing. The aid came with strings attached, subtly integrating recipient nations into an American-led economic and political sphere, ensuring their alignment against the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, viewing the plan as an aggressive act of dollar imperialism and a direct challenge to its own sphere of influence, refused to participate and pressured its satellite states to do the same. This stark division cemented the economic and ideological fault lines of the Cold War. The Marshall Plan, therefore, wasn't just a grand act of humanitarian aid. It was a masterful stroke of realpolitik, transforming economic reconstruction into a potent weapon that fundamentally shaped the post-war world order and defined the opening salvo of a decades-long global struggle for ideological dominance. The Nuremberg trials, immortalized in history, stand as a monumental effort to hold Nazi leadership accountable for their unspeakable atrocities. But beyond the grand stage of Nuremberg, a complex web of other tribunals and prosecutions unfolded across the globe, each grappling with the immense challenge of establishing justice in the wake of unprecedented global conflict. The pursuit of accountability for World War II's horrors was not confined to Germany. It extended to Asia, where the architects of Japanese aggression faced their own reckoning, and in countless towns and villages where local populations sought justice for the crimes committed in their midst. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, famously known as the Tokyo Trials, convened from 1946 to 1948. Modeled on Nuremberg, it brought to justice 28 high-ranking Japanese military and political leaders, including former Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, charged with classic crimes, including crimes against peace and conventional war crimes. The trials meticulously documented the systematic brutality of the Imperial Japanese Army, the rape of Nanking, the Bataan Death March, the use of chemical and biological weapons, and the horrific treatment of POWs. The court's verdict, though controversial in some respects and criticized for omitting Emperor Hirohito, nevertheless established crucial precedents for international law and accountability, just as Nuremberg did for European war criminals. Yet, the true breadth of post-war justice extended even further into lesser-known, often more localized, tribunals. Across Europe, thousands of collaborationists, Gestapo agents, and concentration camp guard were brought before national courts. French, Polish, Dutch, Yugoslavian, Soviet, and many others. These proceedings, often less formal but no less fervent, dealt with crimes ranging from treason and torture to the murder of civilians. Figures like Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon, and Irma Gries, the Hyena of Auschwitz, faced justice in these domestic courts. The legal and logistical complexities were staggering, from gathering evidence in war-torn regions to ensuring fair trials amidst overwhelming public desire for retribution. These varied trials, from the high-profile international tribunals to the regional prosecutions, collectively underscore a profound, if imperfect, commitment to the idea that even in the chaos of war, certain acts remain beyond the pale, demanding universal condemnation and accountability. They cemented the concept of individual criminal responsibility for crimes against humanity, shaping the very foundation of modern international justice. While no trial could fully heal the wounds of war, they attempted to restore a semblance of order and to affirm that history, indeed, holds its perpetrators to account. In the shadow of war's devastation, another economy flourished, a clandestine network born of desperation and scarcity. The black market. As rationing tightened its grip and official supply lines crumbled, millions across Europe and Asia turned to illicit trade not just for luxuries, but for fundamental survival. It was a world where cigarettes became currency, where a loaf of bread could cost a fortune, and where moral lines blurred under the relentless pressure of hunger and deprivation. The black market was not merely a criminal underworld. It was an indispensable, if illicit, artery of survival for entire populations. During the war, strict rationing was imposed by governments to ensure equitable distribution of dwindling resources. But for many, especially in occupied territories, official rations were insufficient or non-existent. In cities like Paris and Berlin, citizens traded family heirlooms for basic foodstuffs. Farmers, often the source of these illicit goods, became powerful figures, their produce fetching exorbitant prices. The trade was risky. Severe penalties, including imprisonment and even death, were meted out to those caught. Yet, the sheer need drove people to take those chances. Cigarettes, particularly American brands, were a universal currency, easily transportable and widely desired, often trading for gold, jewelry, or essential supplies. As the war ended, the black market only intensified. Europe was in ruins, its infrastructure shattered, and millions displaced. The official economies were non-functional, leaving a vacuum quickly filled by illicit networks. From Berlin to London, Rome to Warsaw, anything from penicillin to petrol, coffee to clothing could be found for the right price or the right barter. Demobilized soldiers, with their knowledge of supply lines and military surplus, often became key players, adding to the chaotic landscape. This underground economy was a stark reflection of human ingenuity and resilience, but also of the profound moral compromises forced upon ordinary people. The pervasive black market profoundly shaped post-war societies. It undermined respect for law and order, fostered corruption, and created new divisions between those who could afford its inflated prices and those who could not. Yet, it also prevented widespread starvation and provided a lifeline when official systems failed. It was a chaotic, often dangerous, but undeniably crucial mechanism that facilitated survival for countless individuals and families in an era of unprecedented scarcity, leaving an indelible mark on the economic and moral fabric of the post-war world. In the crucible of World War II, art and culture were far from mere luxuries. They became indispensable weapons, shields, and ultimately, bombs for a shattered world. From the boldest propaganda posters designed to galvanize nations, to the most subtle acts of resistance etched in secret, to the profound expressions of healing in the aftermath, artists, writers, musicians, and performers played multifaceted roles, reflecting, shaping, and enduring the war's immense pressures. Governments on all sides quickly recognized the power of culture to sway public opinion and bolster morale. Propaganda posters, films, and radio broadcasts saturated daily life, demonizing the enemy, glorifying sacrifice, and reinforcing national ideologies. Soviet films like Alexander Nevsky rallied patriotism, while Nazi Germany used Leni Riefenstahl's cinematic artistry to craft a mesmerizing, yet terrifying, image of Aryan supremacy. In Allied nations, iconic images like Rosie the Riveter inspired women to join the workforce, while witty cartoons ridiculed the Axis powers. Art became a visual language of war, a relentless drumbeat designed to unify and compel. Yet, culture also served as a potent form of resistance. Under occupation, artists risked their lives to create works that subtly defied their oppressors. French writers circulated clandestine poems, Polish musicians performed forbidden Chopin in secret concerts, and Jewish artists in ghettos and concentration camps documented the horror and humanity around them, preserving dignity and truth in the face of annihilation. These acts of cultural defiance were whispers of hope in the darkness, affirming the resilience of the human spirit and refusing to let the flame of identity be extinguished. After the armistice, art and culture shifted their focus to healing. War poets like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon had already articulated the trauma of conflict, but the post-war era saw an explosion of artistic expression dedicated to processing grief, remembrance, and the search for meaning. Musicians composed requiems, painters depicted shattered landscapes and traumatized figures, and writers grappled with the moral ambiguities of the conflict. Memorials rose from the ashes, using sculpture and architecture to embody collective memory and warn future generations. Art and culture, having been both instruments of conflict and symbols of defiance, ultimately became vital tools for societies to mourn, to reflect, and to begin the arduous journey of reconstruction, not just of buildings, but of the human spirit itself. They remain enduring testaments to the complex interplay between creativity and conflict, proving that even in the darkest hours, the human need to create, to understand, and to heal persists. Amidst the roar of cannons and the cries of battle, a silent army often worked alongside their human counterparts, displaying extraordinary bravery, loyalty, and ingenuity. While history books rightly focus on human valor, World War II relied heavily on the incredible, often overlooked contributions of animals. From the smallest messenger pigeon to the largest warhorse, these unsung companions played vital roles in every theater of war, saving lives, boosting morale, and performing tasks that technology simply couldn't. Dogs, with their acute senses and unwavering loyalty, served in a multitude of capacities. German shepherds, Dobermans, and collies were trained as sentries, detecting enemy patrols with uncanny accuracy. Messenger dogs carried vital dispatches across dangerous terrain, often under fire. Search and rescue dogs located wounded soldiers and civilians trapped in rubble. Anti-tank dogs, tragically, were trained by the Soviets to carry explosives beneath enemy tanks, a testament to both their training and the desperate measures of war. Perhaps most poignantly, mascots like Stubby from World War I, but indicative of the continuing tradition, provided comfort and a much-needed emotional anchor for weary troops, becoming beloved members of their units. Pigeons, often dismissed as mere birds, were critical communication links. With radios unreliable or unavailable on the front lines, hundreds of thousands of homing pigeons carried crucial messages across vast distances and enemy lines. Birds like G.I. Joe from a U.S. Army Pigeon Service saved over 1,000 British troops in Italy in 1943 by delivering an urgent message that averted an accidental bombing. Their small size and speed made them ideal for covert operations, often flying through artillery fire with life-or-death information. Horses, despite the rise of mechanized warfare, remained indispensable, particularly on the Eastern Front where vast, muddy terrains made vehicle travel difficult. The German Wehrmacht alone employed over 2.7 million horses for transport, artillery pulling, and reconnaissance. Mules and donkeys also played crucial roles in mountainous regions. Their strength, endurance, and ability to navigate challenging landscapes filled critical logistical gaps. From rats trained to detect mines, to dolphins scouted for underwater operations, the animal kingdom made sacrifices often forgotten. Their stories remind us of the immense and diverse costs of war, highlighting the profound bonds forged between species in the face of unimaginable adversity. These animal heroes, through instinct and training, demonstrated a form of courage that transcends human understanding, leaving an indelible paw print on the history of the greatest conflict. While the human cost of World War II is immeasurable, the conflict also exacted a devastating and often overlooked toll on the natural world. Beneath the headlines of battles and casualties lies a hidden environmental catastrophe, a legacy of scorched earth, poisoned landscapes, and disrupted ecosystems that continues to scar our planet decades later. The war wasn't just fought over territory. It fundamentally reshaped it, leaving profound ecological wounds that whisper through the trees and seep into the soil. The sheer scale of warfare brought unprecedented environmental destruction. Relentless bombing campaigns pulverized cities and vast swathes of countryside, turning fertile fields into barren craters. Forests, once vital carbon sinks and wildlife habitats, were felled en masse for timber to build trenches, bunkers, and ships, leading to severe deforestation. The D-Day landings, for instance, transformed tranquil Norman beaches and orchards into an industrial battlefield, with the immediate destruction giving way to long-term soil degradation and biodiversity loss. Scorched earth tactics, employed particularly on the Eastern Front by both Soviet and German forces, deliberately annihilated crops, poisoned wells, and destroyed infrastructure, creating desolate, uninhabitable zones designed to impede enemy advances. This strategy not only caused immediate famine, but also left agricultural lands infertile for years. Furthermore, the massive consumption of natural resources, oil, coal, iron, aluminum, to fuel the war machine put immense strain on global ecosystems, accelerating extraction rates and leaving behind vast industrial waste. The chemical residue of war lingered long after the last shot was fired. Unexploded ordnance, including bombs, shells, and mines, remained buried, poisoning soil and water for generations and posing constant dangers to civilian populations and wildlife. Chemical weapons, though used sparingly in direct combat, were stockpiled and sometimes dumped at sea, creating ecological time bombs. Military equipment, abandoned in battlefields or scuttled at sea, continues to leach pollutants into delicate marine and terrestrial environments. From the contaminated soil of former battlefields to the sunken ships littering the ocean floor, the environmental scars of World War II serve as a stark reminder of wars. Comprehensive destructive power. This hidden cost, rarely discussed in our conventional narratives, underscores that conflict extends its reach far beyond humanity, leaving an enduring an often irreversible impact on the very landscapes and ecosystems that sustain life, compelling us to consider the full, devastating price of global conflict. The roar of cannons, the shriek of incoming shells, the desperate cries from the battlefield. These were not just sounds of destruction, but often the crucible of accelerated human ingenuity. World War II, a conflict defined by unprecedented savagery, also birthed some of humanity's most profound medical breakthroughs. The battlefield became an unwilling laboratory, where the urgency of saving lives pushed the boundaries of what was thought possible. Before the war, blood transfusions were a complicated, often localized affair. But with millions wounded and bleeding out on front lines from Stalingrad to Okinawa, a revolution was desperately needed. Enter figures like Dr. Charles Drew, an African-American surgeon who pioneered large-scale blood storage techniques, transforming how blood plasma could be collected, processed, and shipped across oceans. His work laid the foundation for modern blood banks, allowing for mass transfusions that directly pulled countless soldiers back from the brink of death. Imagine a field hospital, chaotic and grim, yet empowered by readily available plasma, turning the tide for a soldier who, just years prior, would have been condemned to bleed out. This wasn't just a military advantage. It was a humanitarian triumph, a system that would save millions of civilian lives long after the last bullet was fired. Then there was penicillin. Discovered by Alexander Fleming in 1928, its mass production seemed a distant dream. The war changed everything. Confronted with rampant infections, gangrene, pneumonia, tetanus, that claimed more lives than bullets, Allied powers poured resources into developing methods for industrial-scale penicillin production. By 1944, American pharmaceutical companies, driven by government contracts, were producing billions of units monthly. This miracle drug dramatically reduced mortality rates from bacterial infections, transforming the treatment of wounds and diseases. Soldiers who once faced certain death from a simple infected cut now had a fighting chance. Doctors, armed with this powerful antibiotic, could tackle injuries previously deemed fatal, pushing surgical techniques into new frontiers. Advanced trauma surgery, reconstructive procedures for severe burns and shrapnel wounds, and the management of shock became common practice. These innovations, born from the unspeakable horrors of war, became gifts to the post-war world, forever changing public health and medicine, ensuring that even amidst its darkest chapters, humanity found ways to advance, to heal, and to preserve life. While medical breakthroughs brought hope to those fighting, the war exacted a silent, profound toll on the most innocent. Beyond the battlefronts, unseen by the cameras that captured grand invasions, millions of children became the forgotten casualties of a world gone mad. Their struggles, often relegated to footnotes, speak volumes about the war's true, devastating reach. From London to Leningrad, Berlin to Beijing, childhoods were shattered. Cities crumbled into dust, families were torn apart, and homes vanished overnight. Millions became orphans, their parents lost to bombs, bullets, or the silent horrors of concentration camps. Children as young as 5 were left to fend for themselves, scavenging for food amidst the rubble, their eyes reflecting an age-old wisdom born of unbearable trauma. They huddled in refugee camps, their faces gaunt, their innocence stolen by hunger, fear, and exposure. The Allied advance across Europe, while liberating, also revealed the shocking scale of displacement, with children wandering vast distances in search of safety or surviving relatives. And in the darkest corners, some children were not just victims, but were tragically forced into the war itself. While not on the same scale as later conflicts, the desperation of the closing years saw children drawn into partisan units or, chillingly, conscripted into desperate militias like Germany's Volkssturm. Imagine a boy, barely a teenager, handed a rifle too heavy for his frame, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and bewildered determination, facing an enemy he barely understood. These child soldiers, often poorly trained and ill-equipped, were thrown into the inferno, embodying the ultimate loss of childhood. Their resilience, born of unimaginable hardship, was often juxtaposed with the profound, irreparable psychological scars they carried. The post-war world inherited a generation of traumatized children, their trust in humanity broken, their futures uncertain. Efforts to care for these young survivors, through organizations like UNICEF and countless local initiatives, became a monumental task. Rebuilding schools, establishing orphanages, and reconnecting scattered families was a struggle that lasted for decades. The war's impact on children wasn't just about mortality statistics. It was about the profound, generational wound etched into their souls, a testament to the silent sacrifices that history too often forgets. From the profound human cost of childhoods lost, our gaze now turns to another theater of untold suffering, a forgotten corner where brutal combat fused with the unique horrors of nature itself. While the Western Front often dominates our historical memory, the Pacific War was fought across countless, remote islands, a crucible of unimaginable ferocity for both combatants and the indigenous peoples caught in its deadly grip. Imagine the suffocating humidity of the jungle, the air thick with insects, the omnipresent threat of disease as deadly as any bullet. This was the reality of campaigns like Guadalcanal, fought from August 1942 to February 1943, where American Marines and Japanese forces engaged in a horrific war of attrition. Then came Tarawa, a tiny coral atoll turned into a fortress, where in November 1943, thousands died in a matter of days, the waters around the beaches stained red. Iwo Jima, February 1945, a volcanic rock where every inch was paid for in blood, culminated in iconic images but obscured the hundreds of indigenous Okinawans and other islanders who perished. These were not conventional battles. This was close quarters, fanatical fighting, often to the last man. Japanese imperial forces, indoctrinated with a no-surrender philosophy, transformed caves and tunnels into intricate death traps. The infamous banzai charges, desperate last stands, epitomized the refusal to yield. For American and Allied troops, the psychological toll of facing an enemy seemingly impervious to fear was immense. Yet, amidst this carnage, lay the overlooked tragedy of the indigenous populations. On islands like Saipan and Okinawa, civilians, caught between the hammer and anvil of two warring giants, faced starvation, indiscriminate shelling, and even forced suicides to avoid capture. Families were annihilated, entire ways of life eradicated as their ancestral lands became battlegrounds. The pristine beauty of these tropical paradises was irrevocably scarred by bombs, napalm, and the remnants of war. The unique horrors of jungle warfare, the booby traps, the psychological terror of a hidden enemy, the constant struggle against the elements, forged a specific kind of trauma. The legacies of these brutal island campaigns endure not just in the memories of veterans, but in the desecrated landscapes and cultural wounds of the forgotten islands, where the echoes of unseen suffering continue to reverberate, a chilling testament to the war's universal cruelty. From the brutal skirmishes in the Pacific's hidden jungles, we shift our focus to the vast, arid landscapes and vital strategic arteries where another, often unseen, war was raging, the oil war. Far from a mere backdrop, access to and denial of oil was a driving, often desperate, strategic imperative that shaped the course of World War II, a silent, black gold fueling the grandest military designs and the most horrific campaigns. The mechanized armies, navies, and air forces of the 20th century were ravenous consumers of petroleum. For the Axis powers, particularly Germany and Japan, securing reliable oil supplies was a matter of survival. Germany's audacious invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, Operation Barbarossa, wasn't solely about ideology or conquest. A critical objective was the capture of the vast oil fields of the Caucasus, especially Baku. Imagine German panzer divisions, once seemingly unstoppable, bogged down by the sheer distances and the logistical nightmare of fueling an army stretching 1,000 miles from its supply lines. The Battle of Stalingrad, often seen as a turning point of brutal urban combat, was fundamentally linked to the German push to control the Volga River, a vital artery for Baku's oil shipments. Simultaneously, in North Africa, General Rommel's Afrika Korps launched audacious drives towards Egypt, aiming not just for the Suez Canal, a critical shortcut for Allied oil convoys, but for the rich oil fields of the Middle East, particularly those in Persia, modern-day Iran, and Iraq. The desert campaigns, fought with tanks and planes, were a constant race for fuel. For Japan, its expansion into Southeast Asia, including the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, was motivated by an acute need for oil, resources denied by American embargoes. Pearl Harbor, in a bitter irony, was a strike born of desperation to secure these oil-rich territories and create a defensive perimeter. For the Allies, protecting their own oil supplies and denying them to the enemy was equally paramount. The Battle of the Atlantic, infamous for the brutal U-boat war, was fundamentally a struggle to protect oil tankers and supply convoys, bringing vital petroleum from the Americas and the Middle East to Britain and the Soviet Union. The strategic decisions of commanders, the routes of convoys, the targets of bombing raids, all were frequently dictated by the need for oil. This black gold, buried beneath ancient lands, exerted an invisible, yet ironclad grip on the ambitions and, ultimately, the fate of nations, underscoring how deeply interwoven economics and resources were with the devastating tapestry of global conflict. While the world plunged into the ferocious oil war and global conflict, there existed pockets of nations that desperately sought to remain outside the maelstrom. Theirs was a different kind of war, a relentless diplomatic and economic struggle to maintain sovereignty and neutrality amidst a planet consumed by fire. Ireland, Portugal, and Spain, each with unique historical burdens and geographical vulnerabilities, navigated this treacherous path, their predicaments often overlooked in the grand narrative of belligerence. Ireland, a newly independent nation known as Eyre, declared its neutrality in 1939. This emergency, as it was termed, was a tightrope walk. Despite historical animosity towards Britain and a significant Irish diaspora serving in Allied forces, de Valera's government fiercely protected its non-alignment. Yet neutrality was costly. Ireland faced economic hardship, the constant threat of German U-boats sinking vital supply ships off its coast, and a delicate balancing act of internment for both Allied and Axis personnel whose aircraft or ships crashed or landed within its borders. Dublin, though officially neutral, became a quiet hub for intelligence gathering, a subtle battleground of wits rather than weapons. Portugal, under the authoritarian rule of António de Oliveira Salazar, also maintained its neutrality. This decision was largely pragmatic, balancing its centuries-old alliance with Britain against the realities of a continent dominated by Nazi Germany. Lisbon, the capital, became a vital escape route for refugees fleeing Nazi occupation, a truly cosmopolitan city teeming with spies, diplomats, and desperate families. Economically, Portugal played a crucial, if morally ambiguous, role by selling tungsten, a vital component for hardening steel, to both Allied and Axis powers, primarily Germany. This Wolfram trade was a continuous point of contention, highlighting the economic tightrope Portugal walked. Spain, still recovering from its brutal civil war, was under the dictatorship of General Francisco Franco. Indebted to Hitler and Mussolini for their support in his victory, Franco faced immense pressure to join the Axis. Yet, Spain's shattered infrastructure and the exhaustion of its people made active participation impossible. While officially neutral, Spain provided limited material aid to the Axis, allowed German U-boats to use its ports, and even sent the Blue Division of volunteers to fight on the Eastern Front. However, Franco shrewdly played both sides, maintaining just enough distance to avoid full belligerence, thus preserving his fragile regime and keeping Spain out of second, even more devastating, conflict. These neutral nation stories are a testament to the complex moral and political choices demanded by a world at war, where even abstention was an act fraught with peril and enduring consequence. As neutral nations clung precariously to their sovereignty, the vast expanse of Eastern Europe was experiencing a seismic shift, a transition from one tyranny to another. For millions, the advance of the Red Army, pushing relentlessly westward from the Soviet Union, represented a complex, often contradictory, narrative of both liberation and a new, chilling form of occupation. After the decisive victory at Stalingrad in 1943, the Soviet war machine gained unstoppable momentum, spearheaded by formidable commanders like Marshal Zhukov and Marshal Konyev. The Red Army systematically drove back the Wehrmacht, clawing back territory that had suffered under brutal Nazi rule. As Soviet tanks rolled into Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, and the Baltic states, initial reactions were often jubilant. People, emaciated and traumatized by years of Nazi atrocities, cheered their liberators. The sight of the Red Star, replacing the swastika, brought a profound sense of relief from the genocide and oppression of the Third Reich. Yet this euphoria was often short-lived. Beneath the veneer of liberation, a darker agenda was unfolding. Behind the front lines came the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, systematically eliminating perceived enemies of the people and imposing a new totalitarian order. For nations like Poland, which had suffered invasion by both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union in 1939, the Red Army's arrival was particularly bitter. The heroic Warsaw Uprising of August 1944 saw Polish Home Army fighters battling the Germans for 63 days, while the Red Army, stalled on the Vistula's east bank, seemingly watched as the city was systematically destroyed. The liberation of Warsaw later that year felt hollow, merely replacing one foreign master with another, one that would brutally suppress dissent and dismantle national independence. Throughout Eastern Europe, the Red Army's advance was accompanied by widespread acts of reprisal, including looting, destruction, and a horrific epidemic of mass rape. While not sanctioned by high command, these acts left deep psychological scars and fueled resentment. The subsequent establishment of people's democracies, communist puppet states under Moscow's firm control, was a stark testament to the new geopolitical reality. The Iron Curtain began to descend even before the war officially ended, replacing Nazi occupation with decades of Soviet domination. For Eastern Europeans, World War II did not end with the promise of freedom, but with the imposition of a new empire, laying the foundation for the Cold War and an enduring legacy of historical trauma and struggle for true self-determination. As the Red Army reshaped the East, another, equally complex story unfolded across the globe, one that challenges the simplistic narratives of Allied victory. The empires of Britain and France, though fighting for freedom in Europe, relied heavily on the loyalty and blood of millions from their colonial territories. These colonial troops fought valiantly for masters who often denied them basic rights, their sacrifices largely forgotten, their post-war struggles accelerating the irreversible decline of empire itself. From the scorching deserts of North Africa to the frozen battlefields of Italy, from the brutal jungles of Burma to the liberation of France, soldiers from India, West Africa, the Caribbean, and North Africa served with distinction. Imagine the Gurkhas from Nepal, famed for their courage and cookery knives, fighting for the British in the unforgiving terrain of Burma against the Japanese. Picture Senegalese tirailleurs, Moroccan gummiers, and Algerian spies, men who often spoke little French or English, fighting fiercely in Italy or helping liberate Paris, yet often facing racial segregation and discrimination within the Allied ranks. Over 2.5 million men from British India alone served, making it the largest volunteer army in history. These men were promised, implicitly or explicitly, a better future, a recognition of their sacrifice. Many believed that their wartime service would earn them equal rights, respect, or even self-determination. Yet, upon their return home, often, to shattered economies and continued subjugation. They found these promises largely unfulfilled. They had fought for freedom abroad, only to return to colonial rule, often facing continued discrimination, lower pay, and second-class citizenship. The irony was not lost on them. Their experiences, however, ignited a powerful catalyst for change. Having witnessed the weaknesses of their colonial masters, gained military experience, and absorbed ideals of liberty and self-determination, these veterans became potent voices in the burgeoning anti-colonial movements. From India's struggle for independence, led by figures like Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru, to the nationalist movements sweeping across Africa, the seeds of decolonization were sown by the very soldiers who had fought for empire. The long shadow of their sacrifice stretched beyond the war, irrevocably altering the geopolitical landscape, reminding us that even in victory, the legacies of empire were complex, often unjust, and ultimately unsustainable. From the grand narratives of empire and liberation, we now turn to the unheralded heroes whose silent, perilous work formed the very bedrock of Allied victory. They were the men of the merchant marine, the sailors, engineers, and stewards who faced the relentless dangers of the high seas, day in and day out, ensuring that the Allied war machine never ran dry. Their sacrifices, often overshadowed by the glory of combat, were nonetheless absolutely vital. World War II was not just a war of armies and air forces, but a war of logistics. Without the constant flow of food, fuel, munitions, raw materials, and troops across the vast oceans, the Allied effort would have collapsed. It was the merchant marine, operating under the constant threat of U-boats, surface raiders, and enemy aircraft, that bore this monumental responsibility. Imagine the North Atlantic, a cauldron of storms and deadly German U-boats, where convoys of merchant ships, escorted by a thin line of naval vessels, stretched for miles across the gray, churning waves. These men braved not only the elements, but also the terrifying reality of torpedo strike that could send their ship and cargo, along with their lives, to the ocean floor in mere minutes. The casualty rates were staggering. In some nations, merchant mariners faced a higher percentage of fatalities than branches of the armed forces. They endured weeks, sometimes months, at sea, in cramped conditions, often without adequate heating or provisions, knowing that every voyage could be their last. Ships like the American Liberty ships, mass-produced to replace those sunk by the Axis, became the workhorses of the war, carrying everything from Sherman tanks to sacks of flour. Their journeys to Murmansk in the Arctic, supplying the Soviet Union, were particularly perilous, earning them the moniker suicide convoys. These were civilian sailors, thrust into a war zone, without the full military recognition afforded to their armed counterparts. They transported the very fuel that powered the oil war, Section 44, the medical supplies that healed the wounded, Section 41, and the food that sustained entire nations. Their courage, their resilience, and their often unmarked graves at the bottom of the ocean represent one of the most profound and essential sacrifices of World War II. They were truly the unsung heroes of the supply lines, without whom the Allied victory would have remained an impossible dream, their tireless efforts reminding us that wars are won not just by heroes on the front lines, but by the quiet determination of those who keep the world moving. As our journey through the hidden annals of World War II concludes, it becomes undeniably clear that this global conflict was far more intricate, multifaceted, and morally ambiguous than conventional narratives often suggest. We've unearthed the economic pressures, the forgotten struggles of countless individuals and nations, and the uncomfortable ethical dilemmas that lay beneath the veneer of clear-cut victories and heroic tales. Beyond the celebrated triumphs, we have confronted the staggering human cost, the profound sacrifices that faded from memory, and the unseen prices exacted on all sides. This war didn't just redraw maps. It irrevocably reshaped ideologies, societal structures, and the very fabric of human lives in ways whose echoes are still profoundly felt today, from lingering geopolitical tensions to deeply personal traumas. Understanding these deeper layers compels us to engage with history not as a rigid set of facts, but as a dynamic, complex narrative requiring critical examination. It calls upon us to recognize the full, often contradictory, spectrum of human experience during wartime, the resilience alongside the atrocities, the quiet acts of defiance amidst overwhelming despair. Ultimately, World War II Unveiled reminds us that victory, in its purest sense, often carries a heavy, unseen price, demanding perpetual vigilance against the silences history so easily forgets.